would like to thank Dr. Howard for being here. She did a presentation how living barriers can be used to help shorelines due to rising sea levels. And I thought that is actually perfect for this topic. And so I've reached out and she immediately agreed to come speak to you. So I would like to say thank you very much, Dr. Howard. Those of you who haven't met her before, she is a professor of biology and environmental science here at the University of Clear Lake. And this talk actually is about some research that she has been doing with
Jim Doberstein.
Jim Doberstein, yes, over at Lee College. So this is all very recent and very relevant, and certainly especially for the hint hint Galveston coast.
Good morning, everybody. I want to thank Rowena and Wendy for inviting me to talk to you all. This is a really fun project that it's actually a big group of people that have been working on it. So I'm presenting the data, but I am not the sole researcher here. It has been, and it's continuing, and we're not finished with it yet, a large project between the college, and it's actually the brainchild of Jim Doberstein, Galveston Bay Foundation, Haley Leha has been helping us with that, and then UHCL. And the main focus of it has been evaluating these little tiny sort of homeowner, landowner living shoreline projects to see if they can function as a large salt marsh or wetland would. This is a grant-funded project from the Coastal Management Program in Texas General Land Office. And part of our mission is to disseminate the results. So I'm glad we have more people listening today. And it has a lot of relevance to adapting to a changing climate, as you'll see as we go through these slides. So I don't want to take credit for the idea behind this. That goes all to Jim, but he assembled a really big group to put this all together. So I'm happy to share the results with you. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so here's our problem. We have a lot of shorelines along Galveston Bay that look like this. And you can see this is sort of a high tide. And when we have waves come in here, they're basically eating out the shoreline. And we like to say it's like little shovels. Every time a wave comes in here, it's taking a little shovel full of soil away with it. Makes the water really muddy and it eats away at the bank. This is a similar bank at low tide. And you can see it really, the bank actually might have been out here at one time. It's a concern because we're losing habitat, the salt marsh habitat or the shoreline habitat. And the landowners are very concerned because they're actually losing property. The rule in Texas is that if the water comes up to the land, that all belongs to the state, and your property ends where the water hits your land. So if your land used to be out here and you've got a big shoreline front, then you're losing a lot of land. So it's got sort of two focuses to it, trying to save that land. So we have several causes of shoreline erosion in Galveston Bay. Part of it has to do with wind fetch. So most of our winds over the year are coming out of the southeast. So we're really influenced by the Gulf of Mexico, and our winds coming out of the southeast. So they're basically pushing the water up into Galveston Bay. And what that does is, especially if we have strong storms, is those waves are hitting the north side of Trinity Bay, the West Galveston Bay, or they're coming in here. And because the bay is shallow, the entirety of Galveston Bay, except for the Houston Ship Channel area, is about 6 to 8 feet deep. So when you have a lot of wind coming in, pushing the water in, it's going to distribute the water along these red lines here. And then you can have actually wave action anywhere on the bay. The only time our winds turn around from the southeast is when we have these fronts come in from the north. And if the fronts are strong enough, then they will sort of keep the southeast winds at bay. As soon as the fronts lessen in intensity, then the winds turn around and come back from the southeast again. So there's really no time in the bay when we don't have some kind of wave action that's affecting one end of the bay or not, except when we have these really strong northern fronts that basically push the water out of the bay, and then there's no wave action on the shore. As you can see, even, we don't have large tides in Galveston Bay. Our tidal range at the most, unless we have a storm, is about 1 to 2 feet, often very much less than that. So our tides are basically wind driven. When we have large wind events, then we get more erosion. When we have small event, the normal wind, we're still seeing erosion, but not at the same scale. When we have large wind events, you can actually see big hunks of the shoreline being removed. So we want to try to stop that. Thursday, when we were discussing this, one of the master naturalists asked a very good question. He said, why don't we just let nature take its course? Well, and I don't know if this came up as an answer, but this is not really natural. I mean, obviously the winds are natural, but all of this erosion has been exacerbated by human activity. And you can see there's a lot of human development around the coastline here. So what we're trying to do is maybe help nature try to restore what it should be like, and try to stave off some of the effects of development. So our winds are one of the causes of shoreline erosion. Subsidence that we've experienced in Galveston Bay for the last 50, 70 years, that has been a cause of shoreline erosion, and that's mostly been due to water withdrawals, some oil and gas withdrawal, but mostly water withdrawal around the west side. You can see there's this small city of Houston here that's been the driver of that. And then last and not least is the rising sea level that's coming from a changing climate. So all these are working together to basically make Trinity Bay bigger, make East Bay bigger, West Bay bigger, and remove habitat from along the shoreline. So we're trying to see what we can do to restore some of that shoreline and prevent further erosion. So some of the traditional ways to protect the shoreline have been through armoring or bulkheading. There are several different names for it. The simplest way to do this and the most inexpensive way is just to take riprap and dump riprap along the shore. And what happens with that is when the waves come in, the idea of all this sort of jagged, different sized material, it's going to break up those waves. And as it breaks up the waves, then it keeps the intensity of those waves from eating away at the shoreline. So this is just sort of dumping some rock there. You can see it doesn't really protect that or restore any kind of habitat. This is all sort of upland vegetation here. And all they're trying to do with this is prevent further erosion. This is another one. I think this one had some concrete bags at one time. This is another mechanism of stabilizing the shoreline. They just take these big bags of saccharete and they line them up. And then as the water comes in, it just solidifies the concrete. Again, there's not much natural going on here as far as plant life or animal life. Doesn't really support that. But in a way, it does support at least for a while, it will support the shoreline. Probably the most popular one for at least communities and parks, because it looks better than these two, I guess, is to bulkhead it. And you can see this one has been bulkheaded with wood. This one's bulkheaded with sheet metal. And what they're trying to do here is this one's just constructed, and you can see the eroded shoreline behind it. So they try to put a wall up basically and then fill in behind it. And then they'll plant grass all the way out to the end. And you can see there's absolutely nothing sort of ecological or natural about these armored sites. And this one in particular, you can see it may have had some issues with it. So they put riprap in front of it. So it's a difficult battle because armoring doesn't solve the problem. As you'll see in these pictures.
There was a question.
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Andrew wants to know, says, for traditional armoring, is this relatively cheap and does it need a lot of maintenance?
To answer your first question, I have a slide coming up that sort of compares the costs of them. Traditional armoring is not the cheapest way to go. Dumping the riprap is the cheapest way to go. And it does require maintenance, as you can see in this slide. If you don't keep them maintained well, then they're going to fail. And the reason they fail is because we can't stop the wave action. The waves are going to keep coming in, and they eventually will undercut the bulkhead. And once they undercut the bulkhead, then they're going to continue to erode the soil behind the bulkhead. And then you get something that looks like this. This is actually eroding behind it. You can see it better in here too. And when the bulkhead fails, you've lost the soil behind the bulkhead, and then there's nothing to hold the bulkhead up and it'll fall over. Another problem with traditional armoring that you can't really see, but maybe I can describe it here, is that the bulkhead will protect this part of the soil, but then you get the edges of the bulkhead, and it's sort of when the waves hit your bulkhead, then they get distributed sideways and they'll go around the bulkhead, and then they'll start eroding the land on either side of the bulkhead. And then that water eventually, if it's on the edge of the bulkhead, then it'll go in behind the bulkhead, and then it'll start eroding from the sides. So without constant maintenance on these, they are going to fail eventually. Did that answer your question, Andrew?
Yes, thank you. And by constant, you mean monthly, yearly, or like weekly?
No, probably yearly, or at least monitor. They have to be monitored. And if there's, let's say there's a big storm and the storm may have undercut it a bit, they have to go out and at least pay attention to what's going on out there. And it may be after some kind of a weather event that they need to check on it. But it doesn't take very long for a bulkhead to fail once it gets water behind it. Besides being expensive to maintain, and they're not going to last forever, you can see there's really nothing ecologically beneficial to them at all. So that's why we have living shorelines, to try to compensate for this. So here's examples of a couple of living shorelines. In a living shoreline, what you have to do is sort of bulkhead, but it's not the same. It's not an armoring. It's some kind of maybe riprap or the concrete bags. You can see concrete bags along here, but some way to sort of stop the waves, reduce the fetch a little bit. And then here, this shoreline probably was out here at one time. And so what they're trying to do is restore that original shoreline. Well, I shouldn't say the original shoreline. We're just trying to put something in it that's a little more ecologically friendly to prevent further erosion on this land. So we stop the waves, and then sometimes there's sediment that's pumped in here. Oftentimes it's just sort of planted on maybe 3 feet or 6 feet centers with appropriate grasses, and then you let them fill in. And this is necessary and needs to be maintained a little bit, but there's no problem with having water come in here. We want water to come in here because we make an intertidal zone out of it. And you can see in this one a little bit closer up, we've got Spartina or Sporobolus and other appropriate species for wherever the living shoreline is being created. And here you have the landowner property that's no longer eroding away. And we have a nice ecological buffer zone between the waves and the property. So that's the idea behind living shorelines. So here's the slide I was talking about before. What kind of material is used for living shorelines is going to, I guess it's not directly answering the question, but you can select the living shoreline mechanism of creation by 2 things. You look at the amount of energy of waves that is hitting that shoreline, and you also balance that with how much money you've got to spend on the project. So if it's low energy, you just have little waves that are lapping up along the side or lapping up against the shoreline, then maybe you don't even need to construct a breakwater. All you need to do is plant. And the nice thing about planting these marsh plants is they tend to help the soil become more sticky. And the stickier the sediment is in here, the more sediment will accrete in there, and the more plants can grow in there as well. If you have no plants at all, there's no roots holding the sediment together, and the chemical changes that they make in the soil to make it more sticky, to make it more accretable, aren't there. So all you have to do is plant a few plants and it gets the process started. So that's the simplest way to go. If you have higher energy waves hitting the shoreline, then maybe you want to grade the shoreline, make it, instead of having a straight cutoff from erosion. You put some material in there to lessen the slope, to make it a gentler slope. Then you plant on that. If you have more high energy waves, then you might want to put in a breakwater. It's never going to be an armored site. Sort of looks like it could be armored, but all this is doing is breaking up the waves. You either do it with riprap. These are some concrete balls that have been experimented with. And if you leave those out long enough, you can get oyster reefs along them. Oysters make great breakwaters. And then if you are in an area where you have a lot of energy, and we call that high profile energy, then you might need to put a lot more material in there to keep those waves, to knock back the energy of the waves so you can protect the plants. In this one, you can see that there's a bulkhead here. And to protect the bulkhead, they put in the breakwater, and then they've planted a marsh in front of the bulkhead. This is the most expensive way to go, but sometimes that's what you have to do if you've got high energy waves that are cutting into that shoreline. Okay, so Jim Doberstein used to work for the Galveston Bay Foundation. And when he was working there, it was probably over 20 years ago, he got into living shorelines. They are not unique to Galveston Bay. They've been used on the East Coast. They've been used on the West Coast. They're used along the Gulf Coast, but they hadn't been used much in Galveston Bay when Jim was at Galveston Bay Foundation. So he had an idea to see if he could talk to landowners and get their support in doing some demonstration living shorelines on their property so that they could see what the benefits were. And over time, there are now more than 30 of these. The green dots are shoreline protection projects that have had some kind of funding behind them, but the little blue triangles are the ones that we're sort of targeting. These are private landowners that want to protect their property, and they have decided to work with Galveston Bay Foundation to establish these living shorelines. So I'm going to go into talking about our project, because what we were trying to do in our project was look at how well these small scale living shorelines function ecologically. We know that big shoreline marshes have great ecological function. They recycle nutrients, they provide habitat, they clear the water, they stabilize the sediments. They're really good buffers against hurricane storm surge. They have really high value to us. But these little tiny shorelines that may only be a few hundred feet, we wanted to see if they perform ecologically the same way that the large ones do. So we chose 3 sites, one here in the Upper Bay, one over here on the eastern side of Trinity Bay, and one down here in West Galveston Bay. And the sites that we chose were at least 20 years old, because we wanted to make sure that they had been there long enough to at least develop the ecological functions that we were looking at. We chose those 3 sites because they are all different in terms of their environmental conditions in the bay. You know, we have high salinity bays toward the Gulf of Mexico, and then when you get up in the upper bays, the salinity is low. We have a wide fetch of wind, either coming out of the south or coming out of the north across Trinity Bay, which is very shallow. And then we have different characteristics. This is the most high salinity. And as far as wave action goes, this is pretty significant too, because it's very short. Up here is probably the calmest area. So we have low salinity, sort of calm. We have high, well, actually this is low salinity too, because it gets the Trinity River flow. This one was most eroded because it not only had the wind fetch, but the Trinity River coming out, I guess it comes out right about here, and it tends to flow around the east side of Trinity Bay as it comes out here. You can sort of see the flow on this map. So this was highly eroded from Trinity River as well as from wind. And then we had the high salinity, not quite as eroded, but just different characteristics down here. Question?
Does the cost for the living shorelines fall on the landowner, or are there programs to help with the cost?
There are programs to help with the cost.
Okay, and then the next part of that question, is the 20-year mark a representation of the climax community?
No, and that's one of the conclusions that we had. That's really jumping to the end. The 20-25 years is how long, those are the oldest ones. That's about when the program got started. So we don't really have any that are older than that. So we tried to choose the ones that were established, that had succeeded, and were the oldest ones that we could get an idea from. I think we'll see other results as we, look at this from another 10 years, we'll see other results. But I think you'll see in our results that we don't think it's quite enough time yet. This is our project. We wanted to study these 3 sites across Galveston Bay, one in the upper bay, one in the middle bay, Trinity Bay, and then one in the lower bay. The ones that we investigated were Galveston Bay Foundation program sites. These are landowners, or in one case, it's a community park that worked with Galveston Bay Foundation to get these living shorelines built. And so our study was comparing the efficacy of small-scale habitat restoration for the purpose of shoreline stabilization. And we wanted to look at how well they functioned ecologically as well. So it's a big partnership with Galveston Bay Foundation, Lee College, and Clear Lake. Our project was funded, and we're very grateful for this funding, from the Texas Coastal Management Project. The first part of the project was about $100,000. We finished that one up this past year. And then we're going to continue it now with funding from the Galveston Bay Estuary Program for the next 2 years. There's our sites, and like I said, it was a big project. It involved a lot of moving parts. We examined the plant community. We examined the nekton or fish community that was utilizing the intertidal zone here. We investigated the benthro macroinvertebrate community. That's all the little critters that live in the sediments in these grasses. We looked at the microbiologic community, or the microbiome, that is also part of the sediment. And the idea here is that you need microbes because the benthics feed on the microbes. And then you need the benthic macroinvertebrates in there. They also feed on part of the plants, but you need the plants and the benthos to feed the nekton community. So what we were trying to look at was ecologically sort of touch all the bases that might be utilizing these living shoreline areas. And then, because Galveston Bay, unfortunately, is pretty urbanized and has been for a long time, we wanted to look at sediment contaminants. And so we looked at organics, primarily trying to check for pesticides. And then we looked at heavy metals. And then we flew drones and looked at satellite imagery to study the shoreline stability and the loss of shoreline over the past 20 years. So it was a big project, involved a lot of people. And Jim and I, as the university people, we involved probably about 20 or more students on the project in one way or another. And like I mentioned before, this is Jim's sort of brainchild, and he did some preliminary work with students from Lee College for a few years before we did the big study. And I'm grateful that Jim and I have worked on a number of projects in Galveston Bay, so I'm very happy that he included Clear Lake on this. A lot of students get a lot of experience that they can use toward their future careers. And I know you guys are all interested in students. So,
Cindy, I have another question. This is from Michael. Does the degree of incline of a graded slope influence plant choice to stabilize the shoreline?
Yes, that's a great question. So as you can see here, this is Spartina alterniflora. It actually its name has been changed, but all of us that work with it still call it Spartina. We don't like the new name change, but I'll tell you about that in a second. Anyway, this is a low marsh plant, and it has to be inundated. It has to go under. It has to have water come in and water go out on a regular basis. It doesn't like to be standing in water all the time, and it doesn't like to be dry all the time. So you can only plant Spartina in the intertidal zone. If the slope is steeper, then maybe the Spartina is only going to be at the bottom of the slope, and then you'll be planting other sort of mid-marsh plants that don't need to be immersed as much on the higher slope. And sometimes, because we like Spartina the best, you may want to make the slope so that you've got a large area of this truly intertidal sediment, so that the Spartina will do better. Because this is a really anchor plant here, and it's very ecologically important. Okay, so these are our study sites. We did a Sullivan. This is private property, living shoreline along Trinity Bay. That's this over here. Clear Lake Forest Park, which is on Lake Mark, Houston, and Armand Bio, and the O'Donnell living shoreline in West Galveston Bay, which is down here. And these are a little bit small, but in each place, our study design was to choose a reference area, a living shoreline area, and a bulkheaded area, all within close proximity of one another. And we wanted to make it the proximity as close as possible, so they would all three areas would be experiencing the same environmental conditions. So this is our summary of findings. You can see we have a lot of students working. This is being out in the field collecting plants. This was doing some benthic macroinvertebrate work in the lab. This is all looking at tiny critters under the dissecting scope. We did some I guess this is the microbiology here, did biomass, plant biomass. This is collecting samples out in the field again. So in all these pictures are students from UH Clear Lake and Lee. Some of them were students in both places at the same time. So had a really great group. Okay, I'm going to give you some data here because this project was really data driven. And I'm not going to give you all the data. We're just going to give you a little sampling of it so you can see how we reached our conclusions about the study so far. So in each one of these, this is Armand Bio reference sites, Armand Bio living shorelines. Then this is Trinity Bay reference, Trinity Bay living shorelines. And this is West Galveston Bay reference and living shorelines. And we compared our data from this study with data that Jim's students had collected as a pilot study in 2018. And then we put these little lines in here so we can tell them apart. But I know there's a lot of stuff on here, but if you compare the 2021 and 2018 for Armand Bio, Trinity Bay, and West Galveston Bay, the reference sites look pretty stable in terms of the plant community. And what we were measuring here was species importance values, which is a way that we look at we use stem density, we use percent coverage, we use a bunch of different factors to determine how important that species is to that site. We do that by placing these 1 meter frames or plots and then identifying the plants and counting all the stems within there. And then there's a formula that we use that we can come up with the importance value. So in Armand Bio, you can see they're pretty close to the same. And the blue is Spartina alterniflora, or Spirabolus alterniflorus is its new name. And it's a dominant plant in the reference sites in all three locations. And it doesn't change much between 2018 and 2021. Then when we look at our living shoreline sites, you can see there's some differences here. The oldest of these sites is the West Galveston Bay site. This was 25 years old. And the Armand Bio and the Trinity Bay sites are 20 years old. If we look at West Galveston Bay, these two living shorelines values they're not significantly different from the reference site. So in 25 years, it looks like, even though there's still some succession going on here, they are close to being the same, at least on the plant end, the same, similar to the reference site. But when we look at these sites that are not 25 years old, and they also have some other environmental challenges with them, they're different. So Armand Bio, for example, in 2018, we had over 50% Spartina alterniflora, which had been planted there in 2011. When we went back in 2021, there was no Spartina in the places where, and we had a transect line, so we had to put our plots down in specific places. There was still Spartina in the area, but it was not in our plots. Instead, this is 3 square stem, and it was replaced with that. The sediment was also different. And so interestingly, and I don't have a picture of this, but the living shoreline site was actually next to a armored site. And this is sort of an example of how over that time, there was some erosion on the edge of the armoring site that actually affected the living shoreline site. So something's going to need to be done about this. When we go over here to Trinity Bay's got some issues because it has a highly erosive force from the Trinity River. And as you'll see with the importance values, it's not really telling us how many stems are there. It's just telling us that of the stems that are there, which species are the most important. This is so highly eroded that a lot of the reference site is gone. The living shoreline site is still in, looks like some kind of succession. And then this is also in the plant community. We looked at biomass and we got some interesting results from biomass as well. This is, again, Armored Bio reference, living shorelines reference for Trinity Bay and shoreline, living shoreline. The reason you don't see any armored sites on this is because there were no plants at any of the armored sites, so they don't show up on these graphs. But on this one, we're looking at shoot biomass on the top of this line and then root biomass below this. And you can see the older living shorelines have really deep roots. In fact, they are significantly deeper than the reference site. Now, in this case, the reference site over the past 5 to 8 years now, our reference site was in the Hance Biomarsh, and the Hance Biomarsh has had a big breakwater put in front of it, and it's changed the habitat behind it. So we're thinking that there's some changes there that may have reduced some of the grasses. But when you look at the older living shorelines, they're definitely performing at a higher rate than the younger ones. And so we think, again, succession is probably contributing to that. Stem density, comparing 2021 to 2018, again, you can see that 2021, in a lot of these cases, we're seeing less stem density than we saw in 2018 in some of the reference sites, and more stem density in 2021 in, well, it's not really, it's mixed results, but again, the stem density is higher across the board in the older living shoreline. And then this one is just looking at the different species that make up the stem density. And again, in the West Galveston Bay, the older one, we have higher stem density. It's pretty much dominated by Spartina. We have more diversity, but less stem density in the upper bay sites. And this could be related also to salinity. For the benthic macroinvertebrate community across the board, and now we did see benthic macroinvertebrates at the armored sites, but at every single site, the reference site had higher numbers of taxa than the living shoreline or the armored site. But when we looked at the total number of individuals, it was even more striking that the total number of individuals at the reference and at the living shorelines were highly significantly greater than the number of organisms we saw at the armored sites. So even though we have some diversity of species there, we don't have the number of individuals. So this is right away tells us that the ecology of the living shoreline sites is much closer to the reference and much better than what we see in the sediments near the armored sites. These metrics suggest that our living shoreline sites may still be undergoing community development by succession, just like the plants, because what our hypothesis is that if the living shoreline is functioning optimally, we're going to have the same diversity and the same abundance as we have at the reference sites. These are the kinds of critters that we're looking at in the benthos. This is a Streplospeo worm. It's probably about 1 millimeter long. Now, this is the microbiology community, and this is a real busy set of graphs, but they tell us one thing, and that is that all of our sites are pretty similar. When you look at all these colors, there's little differences between the microbiological community at each of the sites and each of the treatments. So it's showing us that the sediments in Galveston Bay are pretty ubiquitous, or the bacterial groups in these are found everywhere. But one of the groups that does have some difference is the groups in purple. That's the ones that he put out here, which are the nitrogen cycling bacteria. And in the Arma biosite, they're significantly higher than they are in the reference site. They're significantly higher than the living shorelines, and those are significantly higher than the armored site. So because the microbiologic community we feel is the foundation for all the succession that's going on, we think that when the bacterial community resembles more of the reference site, then we'll see more of the other animals associated with that. You can see in the Trinity Bay site, we're seeing sort of the same relationship, except there are no significant differences. But in the West Galveston Bay site, there's really no significant difference at all. This may have something to do with salinity. This may have something to do with erosive forces. We don't really know that. We're just sort of hypothesizing at this point. So this is the sort of the really interesting stuff that's going on here. This is from the satellite imagery and the drone work that Amanda Hackney from Black Cat GPS helped us with. This is the Trinity Bay. This is the reference site in 2016, which is the first time they did some preliminary data out here. And there
was a question that popped up about the previous slide. Andrew wants to know, was bacteria the most dominant microbe, or was there any fungus found?
They didn't look at fungus. So they were just looking at the microbes. There's a lot that we, in a future study, we're going to be picking up, but we didn't look at fungus. This is the study area that was flown with the drone. And in 2016, this was the extent of the shoreline. In 2018, the shoreline had backed up to here. And then in 2022, the shoreline had backed up to here. And this is our reference area. And so where we had transects set in the reference area in 2018, when we went back in 2022, a lot of that transect was just gone. And you can see the retreat there. And this was, I think this represented like about maybe 20 feet. It was, or might have been even more than that. It was a significant loss of shoreline in about 6 years. But when you move to the living shoreline, which is basically just down maybe 100 yards down the bay, this is the living shoreline over the same time. This living shoreline is 20 years old. So this is where it was in 2020. I'm sorry. Well, you can't even tell because that hasn't changed. It's just very, very slight erosion, just little places. But by and large, the living shoreline has not changed in those 6 years. So this is a picture of what we were just looking at. This is the failing bulkhead. So no, it's not the picture of what we just looked at. So what we did is the farthest north site was the reference site. Then in the middle was the living shoreline site. And then at the bottom of this, and this is all within about maybe a quarter mile, was the bulkheaded site. And this bulkheaded site had significantly failed. This is where it was. This was our study area. This is where it was in 2016. So you can see it's pretty intact there. Then it failed. And this is where it was in 2022. In 6 years, that much erosion had occurred. So that's the same site as this, which is just a little bit of ways with a shoreline, living shoreline. And then this is the reference site. So significant erosion in this area that was basically stopped by the living shoreline. So our conclusions is that living shorelines can successfully promote the establishment of aquatic habitat that's similar to natural habitat in the same system. We have to help it along by planting. I don't think we have any evidence of a successful living shoreline that sort of establishes itself. It takes some human intervention to get it started. But once you get it started, as long as, go out and check it every once in a while, it should be okay, especially given the examples of the ones at West Galveston Bay and Trinity Bay. In cases where more severe erosion of the shoreline habitat is occurring, living shoreline applications may also be a preferable approach to both shoreline stabilization and restoring shoreline. So this is our living shoreline right up here, and this is the reference area up here. So Trinity River comes out up here. This is the north, and it basically comes around here, and it just is wiping out the shoreline. And this one's sort of upside down to that, but it basically took out this is this part here. It took out this much here. You can see it was undercut. And so just right up just a few tens of yards from this, we have a perfectly stable shoreline with a living shoreline. So that's a severe erosion area, but obviously the living shoreline does a better job. Is there a question?
If bulkheading fails compared to living shorelines, why would an owner choose to go that route instead of a living shoreline? It's just lack of education or just what's traditionally done?
There are still a lot of people out there that think a living shoreline looks messy, is dangerous, has snakes. It's education. They like the look. They like the clean look of the wall. They're not thinking about the future that it will fail at some point. I think you're right. Education is the key here. We see a lot of people that just don't like marshes. So you're right. You're right. I think education is the key. So Kathleen, I see you raised your hand, but I cannot see you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
There you go. I guess I was responding to that same question. Some of the things that we've heard over the years is, for one thing, a living shoreline does make that coastal area in front of your property more difficult to access with your boat.
That's true.
So if you're pulling your kids on their tube or their whatever, you're doing recreation with your kids out there, they have a tendency to want to bring that boat right up next to the bulkhead so that the kids can load out. If they don't, especially if they don't have a dock or they don't want to use their dock, the kids can, run out there onto the end of the grass and they jump onto the tube and off they go. They don't want the health hazards associated with riprap or the breakwater or oysters. So there's that. I've mostly heard objections to it from people who have grandkids and kids, and they want that access that the bulkhead provides.
So I guess the solution to that is what they've done at the O'Donnell site. They have a dock, and the dock goes out over the marsh. But I guess that's more money too. So yeah, and it's too bad because we're always putting human interests over if their bulkhead is failing and they're losing their land, I think that makes them more amenable to looking at other options like living shorelines. And that may be why we have living shorelines where we have these 30 plus projects, maybe because the landowners had no other way that was working for them.
There is another question from Larissa.
Okay.
She's asking, could this ever become something that's required for people that own property on the water? I'm not sure of the legal EPA regulations for shoreline ownership.
Now, it's sort of out of my area. I don't think in Texas we can require this. They may have, I'm thinking maybe the West Coast might have more of a success in requiring their landowners to do it, but there's nothing right now that can require anybody to do this.
Let's say an owner does decide to install a living shoreline, and I know you and your team did an extensive study of how successful they were, but what can landowners do? What are the most important parameters to test and the easiest way to monitor their success of their living shoreline?
First of all, if they are working with Galveston Bay Foundation can recommend what they need to use and how to put it in, and can help with all of that. They've got a whole group there that this is what they do now. Monitoring is not that hard. If they're really interested in, they like to, especially if they're into native plants or they're into any kind of ecology, all they have to do is basically watch it. You can see when you're starting to lose plants. You don't even have to do transect analysis like we did. You don't have to do a lot of sediment analysis. Just watch it. If it looks like it's filling in and it's healthy and it's, they're going to succeed, go through ecological succession because that's nature. And so they will change over time. But, if they're interested in wildlife and just green plants and their shoreline is not eroding, then that's pretty much all they need to do. And if they start having problems with it, just work with Galveston Bay Foundation to do what needs to be done to shore it up, I would say. They could do it all on their own if they want, but there's plenty of places for help.
I've got a question about like landowners competing with landowners. So if people have an armored front, and they're usually going to be like a fence line where they're going to be parallel side by side. And if somebody does a living shoreline, that's going to kind of extend out beyond that armor line there. And so boats may have to go around, especially when you get into maybe the more bayou kind of cross between community / shrimping area. So those may all of a sudden now they're going to start hitting some of that stream bank as they kind of try to get up to there. So there may be some conflict. Is that happening as well?
I don't know of it, but it's possible. You're absolutely right. So the one that we were looking at that had the bulkhead next to the living shoreline, that was in a community park. So it was all within the same ownership area, I guess, if you want to say that. But yeah, it's potentially, if somebody's got a bulkhead that's from their property line to their other property line, and it's going to erode around the next landowner, that there's going to be some problems there, just like, you know, people's yards. There's going to be some problem. Okay, just to finish up then, this is going back to the question earlier. The data that we collected show that habitat creation may take some time to fully reach peak ecological function. And maybe another 10 years it will, maybe it won't, maybe it never will. We don't know yet, but we think that it is progressing in the right direction to function like a normal shoreline or vegetated shoreline would. What we do know is that the smaller they are, the more vulnerable they are to being lost. We don't know what the optimal size is. It's all going to be dependent on the erosive forces that are at play. But if they're too small, then they have a hard time surviving. Okay, so we're not done. We are in the final planning phases for our next study on the same sites. We're going to collect data in 2024. Yes, 2024. We're working on doing the quality assurance plan for Galveston Bay Foundation, and then we'll go back out there. So we collected our data in 2021. We want to go back out in 2024 so that there's a little more time for any changes that might occur. We're going to add microplastics. We may add some more organics in there, maybe add some fungi in there. It'll be a little different, but we want to at least get another marker for the progress that these living shorelines are making. So this is our research team, part of it. You can see we got a whole bunch of students here out in the field. I took this picture before they got in the mud. They did not look like that when we got out of the mud. These are Lee College and University of Houston Clear Lake students. Jim Doberstein is the PI, and then the rest of us here are co-PIs on it. Amanda Hackney worked with the satellite imagery and the drones. My responsibility was mainly the benthos. Haley's from Galveston Bay Foundation. Christine and Yifen are from Lee College. Christine did the organics and Yifen did the microbiology. But we were just the leaders. The students did all of the work. And there was a great group of students with a lot of good stuff on their resumes going forward. So we thank everybody. This is the General Land Office Coastal Management Program and Galveston Bay Estuary Program, Houston Area Research Consortium, Moody Gardens, I forget that one, Fish and Wildlife Service, and all our community partners. We can do it without everybody's support and all our students, definitely all our students. So this is what Jim always says. This is all the methods. He says, if you have a copy of this and you're having trouble sleeping, this is a good slide to stare at for a while and then you'll fall asleep. But if you're interested, that's the methods that we used for all of our analyses.
Since the land under the water belongs to the state, at what point is the landowner's land no longer retrievable? Like if they've lost their land because of erosion, are they allowed to go back and reclaim it?
That's a question I don't know the answer to. I know with living shorelines, we're not trying, the idea is not to reclaim the land, but to prevent further erosion, because as long as it's in her title, it still belongs to the state, or the state claims it. Yeah, I don't, could probably answer that question because he's worked more with it, but with living shorelines, they're not actually reclaiming the land. They're just
Okay.
letting further erosion.
And so do you have to have a permit to do the living shorelines?
It depends what you do. If you're building a bulkhead, yes, you do. If you're putting any breakwaters out, yes, you do. If you're just putting plants out there, no, you don't.
Oh, okay. And so like riprap, you don't need a,
Probably need one for riprap.
okay. All right, excellent. Thank you.
I'm not familiar with this type of ecosystem, this type of marsh or grassland. In succession, just generically, does it require like a fire or a grazing or a mowing, or does it? It's not very similar to a grassland or a prairie system in that way.
No. So when you have succession in a marsh, you're starting out with sediment. The early successional stage is going to be the bacterial community. And as you get that kind of life in there, the whole key here is to make those sediments sticky. And as they make them sticky, then the plants can come in and there's nutrients that get incorporated in the sediment. And then you get Spartina is an early successional plant, but it's also a keystone plant there. But as you get the sediments start building up, then you go from low marsh and then you can get into mid marsh. The more sediments you get in there, the higher that marsh builds up, and then you get more diversity in there. Yeah, it's not the same kind of succession that you see in a prairie grassland or a forest, but it does involve some succession. But most of the time, it stops if you have an intertidal, like in this picture here. If you have this would be at high tide, where the feet or the roots and the bottom of the plants are all wet. And then this will dry out at low tide. If you have an area that's like that, then the anchor, the keystone, the highest successional stage plant, whatever you want to call it there, is going to be, in our area anyway, it's going to be Spartina alterniflora. So it's the pioneer and it's the climax plant. Okay, I guess my time's up. Thank you.